So I'm taking us live on Facebook right now. We should be streaming here in just a moment. I was just telling Scott and Barb and those who might be joining us on Facebook that this is going to be the shortest Bible study I've ever done at FCC. So we're going to keep this because I know the inauguration's coming. So we definitely have to be done in 50 minutes. And so we're going to do that. I'd like us to start by just, as we usually do, offering joys and concerns. What joys and concerns do you have to share?
I'll just remember Dave and know that he will forever be missed in this group.
Yeah.
I've heard so many people talk the last few days about how he was the first friend at church. And so I'll say that, but I'll also remember just a few weeks ago, it was just me, Dave, and Barb on a Bible study with Pastor Eric in the background and Rob Rootson doing it. And it ended up being me and Dave at the end because Barb had to leave a little early. Missed in this group. I've heard so many people talk the last few days about how he was
I'm hearing somebody. Hold on.
Friend at church.
Oh, that's from me. I'm sorry.
So
I'm sorry.
I'll also
I did it.
remember just
Give me a second.
weeks ago, it was just me, Dave.
I don't know where you're talking from. You're speaking to me, but I don't know where you're speaking to me from. I'm sorry.
In the background and
Oh no, why is this doing this to me?
I think it was me, actually.
Oh, was it you? Okay, that makes me feel
Sorry.
better.
Okay, well, I just need the limelight twice, right?
There you go.
So anyway, I just remember that Dave and I sort of had to carry the conversation because we were the only ones left, and it was the most that Dave ever talked in a Bible study, and I just loved everything he had to say. And we were talking about sheep and goats, and I was trying to complicate everything and make all kinds of really intelligent points, and Dave just said, sheep know to be sheep because they're sheep. And that just was Dave. And he just knew how to be a good guy. And I just wanted to share that.
Thanks.
And, yeah, I knew Dave through the Bible study and talked to him at church and always saw him. Had he been ill? I saw that there was prayer for him.
Yeah, he had been.
I don't know if he can share information.
I'll just say, it was very unexpected. He had been minorly not feeling well, but not in it. We had just lifted up prayers for the fact that he was feeling well.
Right.
And he said, I'm feeling well. And there was that painful piece on Sunday where Emily had just lifted it because he said, I'm feeling well. And Emily was like, prayers for Dave for feeling well. And then of course he passed away. And it's, yeah, it was very shocking, very unexpected. And just, it's odd. Like coming at Scott was the first one on this morning. That never happens. It's always Dave. Dave signs on 15 minutes early. He's always ready to go with Bible study. Yeah. I was telling someone I can count on one hand how many Sundays Dave has missed. And the only reason Dave missed a Sunday of church was because he was really sick and he was worried about getting other people sick. Yeah, he and LaDonna were like the two greatest greeters, welcomers of folks to the church. And we've lost both of them this last year. And it's just been, yeah, he will definitely, his presence and a man of no pretension, like kind of what you were saying, Wendy, right?
Yeah.
I also want to be mindful as we gather here in the wake of over 400,000 deaths from the coronavirus, a staggering number that most of us might have thought was unbelievable a year ago. And today is the 1-year anniversary of the first recorded case of coronavirus in the United States. So in exactly 1 year from the first diagnosis to today, it's unimaginable. And experts are saying that it is more than likely that we will reach 500,000 deaths by the end of the next month because we haven't peaked yet, which is, again, staggering and just hard to quantify the level of grief. And so I know I look back at the grief from 9/11 in which less than 3,000 people passed away, or from we are on a track to surpass U.S. deaths from World War II. It's just, and the impact that had on our nation. So there needs to be time of lament. And if at times you just feel overwhelmed, we should feel that way. and it's the inauguration. So, which is a joyful and scary, and it's just a myriad of emotions. But today I am trying to be hopeful. I always say that as Christians, we are called to be eternal optimists, because we believe that the dead can come back to life. And if you can believe that, you can be optimistic about just about anything. So the fact that the first woman is being elected to vice president, or being inaugurated as vice president, is extraordinary. That the first woman of color, of both African American and South Asian descent, I mean, that is an extraordinary milestone for our country, and should not be overlooked in fear of the horrific insurrection and fear of other violence that's coming. And almost every milestone that our country makes is always met by resistance. And so that's also a helpful reminder. Any other joys or concerns that folks have? Okay, I'm going to ask us, in honor of Dave and in honor of the over 400,000 who have passed, I'm going to invite us to take a moment of silence and just silent reflection here. So let's just gather our hearts and minds before God in a moment of silent prayer. God, in your mercy, hear our prayers. Amen. Beloved, today we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. This is an interesting story. It's the calling of the disciples. I want to start out, before we jump into that, we took a little bit of a jump. There's some things that happened since where we left last week and what happened. So what has happened? We had Jesus rebuking the spirits. And so remember last week we had Jesus tried to throw him off a cliff in Nazareth. And when he said that his mission went far beyond just those of Nazareth, and that there were those who were in greater need even than those of Nazareth, and that's who he was going to. It's interesting, though, again, just to push back on the supersessionist, anti-Semitic history of the Christian church, where people are like, look, and then they tried to kill Jesus. And where does Jesus go immediately after that encounter in the synagogue? He goes right back to the synagogue because he is a good Jew. And some of you may be thinking, really, Eric, do we need to bring this up every time? We do. We have a long history to repent from in the Christian church. So I just want to point that up. So we have this man with an unclean spirit. It is that demon that calls out exactly who Jesus is. The first one that says who Jesus is. I know who you are, Holy One from God. Jesus silences the demon and calls him out of it. Right. So, and people are amazed by his authority, by what he can do. After that, he goes to Simon's house. This is an important prelude to today's passage. So he goes to Simon's house. Simon's mother-in-law, which is an interesting piece, mother-in-law, which means Simon was married. Now, we don't know, like, here's the thing. There's no word of Simon's wife. And so whether or not his wife is still living, whether or not his wife had passed, it was interesting in talking with colleagues, Rob McCoy and Katie Zay, both of whom have done some great work globally about women's health and maternal and prenatal health, right? And how quickly we forget often in this country how dangerous giving birth is. And even today it still is dangerous. It was incredibly dangerous at the time. So we don't know what happened with Simon Peter. Is it possible that maybe his wife died from illness or in childbirth or something? Like entirely possible. But we do know that he was married. It is also entirely possible His wife is alive and simply is given no mention in this. She just doesn't, for some reason, fit into Luke's story and is overlooked. I mean, while we don't know exactly who wrote the Gospel of Luke, we can be pretty sure it was a man. And even though Luke's Gospel gives more focus on women than any of the others, it's possible it's just overlooked. But mother-in-law, sick with the fever. There's this kind of incredible thing that happens in which it's... I love this. This is my only reason I want to be a doctor, is to do this. Verse 39, Jesus bent over her and spoke harshly to the fever. I've always wanted to do that when someone's sick and just be like, get out of there, knock it off. Like, I just imagine that rebuke. Either way, there's this, she is cured. And then this is also an important piece because we have a lot to repent in the Christian church, not just anti-Semitism, but also patriarchy. It says she got up at once and served them, which therefore shows that women should always serve men. No, it's actually incredible, right? Diakone, that word there is the root of the word deacon, right? The first deacon, right? The first one who serves is Simon's mother-in-law, Simon Peter's mother-in-law. And that's overlooked so often, right? So when we talk about deacons in our own tradition, the Congregational Church, for the vast majority of the history of our church, women were not allowed to be deacons, which is ironic because the first deacon was a woman, right? And the whole point, what is Jesus' message constantly? If you want to be first, what do you have to do? Be last, right? You have to be a servant to all. As she is healed, she understands exactly what it is. It's not that she's serving the men. It's that she understands that out of gratitude for what she has received, she is called to a life of service. So it's just the ways in which that's been misinterpreted, I think, are also important. Tons of other people come to Jesus, right? The sun is setting. Everyone brought relatives and acquaintances, all sorts of diseases, everybody to Jesus. And all of the demons say, you are God's son. And he spoke harshly to them and wouldn't allow them to speak because they recognized he was the Christ. So what we see here is over and over again, the demons, the ones who are threatened, recognize exactly who Jesus is. Everyone else isn't quite so sure yet. And remember, we talked, even John the Baptist, not entirely sure. Like, knows something good's happening here, new in the womb, but later is going to send his disciples to be like, are you the one? So... and then he keeps going. It says, when daybreak arrived, Jesus went to a deserted place. As an introvert, I always love this, right? Jesus needs to go away to recharge his batteries. The crowds look for him. They find him. They try to keep him from leaving them, right? They want to own Jesus for themselves, right? But he says to them, I must preach the good news of God's kingdoms in other cities too, for this is what I was sent. And he continued, again, preaching throughout the Judean synagogues. So this is all of what we skipped. This kind of leads us, that's the rest of chapter 4, brings us here into chapter 5. Any questions about that before I ask for someone to read chapter 5? And it's just the beginning of that. Okay. Who would like to read? It's chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. We're just going to read this first part. And there's one tricky word, the Lake of Gennesaret. That's the thing. That's the tricky word. Would someone be willing to read that for us?
I will.
Thank you, Barb. Great.
Okay. One day, as Jesus was standing by the Lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore and left everything and followed him.
Thank you. All right, so a couple things, just real quick. Lake of Gennesaret is the Sea of Galilee. It's like, why do they call it a sea instead of a lake? Well, it's a big lake. Here's the funny thing, right? It's a big lake for anybody who's not used to living near the Great Lakes, right? Like, that's a big lake. Sea is a little extreme, right? The sea, like it's got behind my dad's house, there's a pond, right? And it is a pond. He will swear it is a lake. It is not. If I can throw a baseball from one side of it to the other side of it, that's not a lake. That's a pond. Anyway, so it was known by different names. Sea of Galilee, Lake of Gennesaret, same thing. Just kind of a context of the size of that. It's funny. I never quite thought of this. It's 8 miles wide by 14 miles long. Right, so 14 miles north to south, 8 miles the other way. So it's still a good sized lake. I mean, it's no Superior, but it's a good sized lake, right? That's happening here. Okay. Things that stand out in this reading. What speaks to you? What stands out to you? This is a story that I suspect there's actually 2 stories here. One of them you've probably definitely heard. The other one maybe not. What stands out to you?
Well, it seems to be just too simple of a solution. I don't know. We got all these fish, and then we're just going to leave everything behind and go follow Jesus. And it's just too simple.
Yeah.
So there's something here. Obviously, they were amazed by what happened, but that's the thing that strikes me. I mean, it's a of course it makes sense. You got all these fish, I'm going to go follow the guy who delivers all these fish. So that's the thing that kind of struck me. And
okay.
Just seems,
yeah.
Well, it's just that he saw the fish, they caught all the fish, and Peter's reaction is, "I'm a sinful man." What is it about that caused him to recognize he was a sinful man?
Right. Yeah, it seems like an odd reaction as opposed to like, "Hey, thanks for the fish." Like, yeah. My wife loves this. Has nothing to do with Bible study, but whenever I read this, there's a couple ridiculous things I think of, and I always think of my wife loves the Filet-O-Fish sandwich at McDonald's, one of her favorite things, and it's great. So she's the only person I know who's excited about Lent because it goes on sale every Lent, right? Because you can eat fish. It's such a ridiculous thing. So I think it's the great catch of fish at McDonald's. I'm not sure there's actually fish in the fish, but anyway. All right. So it's interesting. So we have 2 stories here, and it's fascinating because we have the story of the miraculous catch, and the story of the calling of this calling of the disciples. And they're in other gospels, most famously John, right? These are really separate. Miraculous catch of fish happens after it's a post-resurrection story. Takes a whole different context. So if you're wondering, like, wait a second, I thought this happened at the breakfast on the beach after Jesus had raised. Yeah, that's the Gospel of John. It happens differently here for different theological purposes, right? So that are there. Maybe there were 2. Other people say there were 2 miraculous catches of fish. Maybe there were. It really doesn't matter. But if you're like, sometimes we read things, we think, wow, I thought that happened at a different point. You may be right. Different gospel, right? So, but we have these 2 stories that are here. A couple things that stood out to me as I was rereading this, which I think is interesting, is why is Jesus in the boat to begin with?
To get away from the crowds.
Well, it's not to get away, but he needs a pulpit, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, not to get away, but to have you're right, to have a better place to speak to people because he couldn't speak from the shore. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so you have to think, and the Lake of Gennesaret, the Sea of Galilee, is really in a bowl, right? So in the north, you've got the Golan Heights, and even in the south, it still kind of sinks in, right? And you have to remember that this is the water from the Golan Heights and the mountains that kind of go north of there. All that when you hear about like that has more water. It's more mountainous. So we hear about the cedars of Lebanon, right? You can't have cedars without water. All that kind of part of it funnels into the Mediterranean Sea. The rest of it kind of funnels there into the Sea of Galilee, which then drains into the Jordan River, which will go to the Dead Sea. And remember, that's the lowest spot on the entire earth, right? So this is it's a bowl. And so what you have here is a natural amphitheater, right? And so when Jesus is sitting in the boat, what he's done is he's created a natural amphitheater so that everyone can hear him. Fascinatingly enough, other people have mentioned how, to some extent too, by backing away and being on the water, actually acoustically, people would have been able to hear him better. So you've heard like how your voice will carry over the water, right? Yes. It's a better acoustical piece there. So people are saying he's actually creating this thing so that the crowds can hear him. So he's not fleeing from the crowds. He's creating an amphitheater so they can hear what he is saying. And he's using Simon's boat as a pulpit. Now, we have two boats here, okay? And we know that one of them belongs to Simon and one belongs to somebody else, right? There's two boats here. Maybe is it the father, is it Zebedee and Zebedee's thing? But what we also have here is a couple things. So fishermen, boats were expensive. So a lot of fishermen would share boats in order to basically create like a fishing corporation, right? They would, a collective, a co-op, so that they would share in the boats and the nets and all those sorts of things. I'm going to jump to the end here, which is interesting because I've heard this story taught and preached about Jesus calling the poor fishermen, right? And I don't know if you've ever, right, that these are fishermen and day laborers. But it's fascinating that in verse, which is it here? It's toward the end, verse, when he leaves, James and John's, he says, oh, you know what? I'm mixing up my gospels. I'm mixing up my gospels, I think. Where it talks about, in one of the other gospels, it talks about James and John, Zebedee's sons. And when they leave their father, James and John, they leave him with the other hired workers. The Gospel of Mark and others say that. It's the Gospel of Mark. Excuse me for that. But so there's an interesting thing, which is if they had hired workers, these weren't necessarily poor fishermen, but they weren't wealthy, right? But it's just kind of like who, just part of the folks he's talking to. Okay. So explain this to me. All of you are experts in your fields, right? And imagine somebody comes, imagine me, right? A pastor comes and is preaching, right? And comes to your place of work, right? And to preach. And then when the pastor's done preaching, then tells you how to do your job better. With zero experience of doing, right? So whatever you're doing, then the pastor turns around and is like, hey, looks like you can use some help with your job. Not with anything else, but very specifically, right? That would be a little presumptuous and strange, I think. What's
especially disturbing if he was right.
Well, right. So there's an absurdity here. The first absurdity. Yeah. What do you know about fishing? Nazareth is not in a body of water. Like, you're the carpenter's son. Stick to carpentry and preaching, right? So that's number one. That's strange. Number two, what does he ask them to do? Go and throw the nets out, right? What have they just spent the entire morning doing?
Throwing their nets out and getting nothing.
Right. Well, not only they did that all night, but then they just cleaned the nets, right? They just finally spent all the time cleaning the nets. So fishermen would often fish at night. That's when the fishing was best. They would do that. By the way, later, there's a whole thing about Peter fishing naked and things like that. If you know that story, that was also an often thing. They would take their clothes and bundle it up and they would fish in the nude. Number one, it's a lot warmer of a climate, more of a tropical climate. So that's not odd. And why get your clothes all gross? If you only had two sets of clothes, why get them gross and all covered in fish guts, right? So they would fish at night, and it's not, like they're out on the boat at night. Like no one's going to do anything. So they're out fishing at night. They don't catch anything. They come back, they clean the nets. They got to get all the seaweed and gunk and all that. There's no fish in there, but everything else, right, out of it. They just do that. Then they finally get everything ready. Presumably, they've been fishing all night. They're going to go to bed. They're working third shift, right? They're going to eat. They're going to go to bed, wake up, work the next third shift out on the fishing boats. But instead, Jesus says, take these nets that you've just cleaned. And what is Jesus's really deep, insightful method of fishing?
Put out into deep water.
Right. Are any of you fishermen or fisher women, fisher people?
Yeah. Sure.
Where do you fish, Scott?
Well, I haven't been fishing much lately or the last few years, but I used to fish in Green Lake, which which is relatively about the way you describe the Sea of Galilee is about the size of the Sea of Galilee.
Right. Yeah.
And,
but when you're trying to catch bass and things, do you stick in the shallows?
Well, yeah, for bass, yeah, but walleye.
Well, for bass you do, yeah.
For walleyes, you go down a little bit lower, but the real catch is the Green Lake trout, which lie at the bottom, about 90 feet under the surface.
Yeah.
And I've caught one in my lifetime, and that was amazing. And it was an accident. But
fair enough. Take it.
But
You're a miracle.
exactly, it was a miracle.
Part of what people have pointed out, others have pointed out, is like put out into the deep water is like, yeah, we're trying to catch schools of fish. Like
right.
And not to mention it's daylight, and the fish are most likely that have been up are going deeper into the water as it warms.
Right.
So
That's
I mean,
true.
again,
Makes sense. Yeah.
Right. It makes sense, but it's also like, okay, like it's not like he's like, here's a new technique of fishing. He does this, right? So the absurdity, he says this, he doesn't say anything too wild and crazy. They do it, which is ridiculous. Like if I came and like Scott, I know that you were a scientist and worked in chemistry. So if I, who literally have never even taken a chemistry class, and how I graduated high school without ever taking chemistry is a whole nother conversation for another time, right? But if I come and tell you how to do your job, who's a doctorate in chemistry, right? Like it's absurd. And I'm like, well, mix these things together, right? It's just absurd. Then if you did it, it's even more absurd. And then if it worked out, it's like, there is this absurd, like there's this imaginable absurdity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The story is not about how to go fishing. What is the story about?
I think it's about, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's about understanding what you're willing to let go for faith. The reason I say that is because you're right. I would completely fight back if someone told me how to do my job, and often do. And when the fishermen let go of that ego or whatever it is and just do it, then they're in this incredible abundance, to the point where the abundance is dangerous. Their boats are almost about to sink. And then in the end, they let go of these nets. So I was just thinking a lot about abundance and what is enough. The Old Testament stories of the manna really always hit home with me. And so I think the story is about what you're willing to let go of in order to walk your faith.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think that's and it's an interesting piece because it reminds me of other stories that are unique to the Gospel of Luke. There are three stories, right? The searching for the lost, right? Which are absurd stories, right? So a shepherd leaves 99 sheep, presumably to be potentially eaten by wolves, in order to search out the one lost one. That's ridiculous. More than that, it's probably the woman, right? The woman who loses a coin and then tears apart the house to find the coin. When she finds the coin, what does she do with it? Spends it to throw a huge party so that everybody can come and celebrate that she found the coin. But you're like, but now you don't have the coin. Like that doesn't seem to. It's like the gift of the Magi, right? But it is this self-emptying, the gratitude that leads to generosity, right? And the two of those, right? Gratitude and generosity going so much hand in hand together. And the fact too that in all of those circumstances, those stories of the lost that we're going to talk about later as we get there, they're all stories too that bring people into community, right? One sheep is brought back in with the 99. The woman, the widow who is alone is brought into the community with everybody. The lost son returns home and is welcomed into the family, right? It's about that. And when you said, Wendy, you know, they get the abundance and they can't, it is to have that much abundance themselves is threatening, right? It is dangerous. And so they have to share it. The other boat has to come and help them to do it, right? They can't have that much abundance themselves. The abundance of God is incapable of keeping it to ourselves, right? Which is an interesting, because what did we just hear before the story? We heard about a community, and what did they want to do with Jesus? Keep him to themselves, right? They had experienced the abundant grace of Jesus, the healing, the teaching, the driving out of demons, and they said, no, we want this to ourselves. We can't bear to let this go. We can't let you go. You have to stay here. But what abundance does is it should call us to share, to give out, to do that. The other piece that's interesting in this, you know, we talk about the absurdity. Is this the last absurd thing that Jesus will say or do? No, right?
No.
Jesus's ministry is absurd. Blessed are the poor. You know what? You know, people who are your enemies, you should love them. In fact, if they hit you, turn the other cheek. Now, by the way, side note, we'll get to it later. Doesn't mean be a doormat, but still turn the other cheek, right? Before you judge others, examine your own life first, and maybe repent in your own life before we start pointing out the foibles in other people's lives, right? The good news of the kingdom is not just for the Jewish people, and it is actually even not just for the Jewish people and other Gentiles, but also reaches out to Samaritans and even Romans and tax collectors who are collaborators with the Romans, and the Romans themselves who are terrible oppressors, right? As an idea of love and grace and sharing that, right? These are absurd things, right? They're ridiculous things. So we might say, really, Jesus? And to one side, we might say, this is absurd. Why are we fishing in the daytime? No, we don't love our enemies. We destroy our enemies. That's what we do, right? And on the other side, which is an odd thing with the story, it's very simple. Go out into the deep water. Is there anything complex about what Jesus calls us to do? No. But as Jesus' ministry, not necessarily in this passage specifically, but as Jesus' ministry, right? The great commandments, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second, which is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Is that complex?
No.
I make it complex, but it's
no question, right? You know, I think about this. I think, you know, if I'd been out fishing all night and I think, okay, we went out fishing. In fact, we did this. I went on a fishing trip to Algoma, Wisconsin, which is just south of Door County. Yeah. And I was there with my family, and we were fishing the great salmon fishing, Lake Michigan.
Sure. Oh, yeah, that's great. I've done that. Yeah.
Yeah. So we woke up 4 a.m, bright and early, went fishing for a week, every single morning. Nothing. Nothing. Now, by the second or third day, you better believe we were going down to the fit. We spent more money on lures and gadgets and new reels. I mean, anything we could do to catch a salmon, right? We made it as complicated as possible. And we're out there fishing. There's a guy who's out there who's fishing. I mean, every day, boom, he's got one. Boom. It's not that there weren't fish there. Everybody else is catching fish. Finally, we asked the guy, like, what are you doing? He goes, just fishing. On the lure, cast it out. It's not like he looks at us like, what are you doing? Like, it's not that, right? We like to overcomplicate things, right? We want to do that. Part of it is this guy had been fishing every day there for the last 30 years. We just came in from nowhere, almost never been salmon fishing in our life, and just expected, well, we're just going to jump in like this, you know, right? That we overcomplicated it. As you said, Wendy, we overcomplicated it. It's not a complicated thing. in this story, what Jesus tells them is not, go out and throw your nets in the deep water. Oh, thanks, Jesus. We hadn't considered that. We just keep throwing our nets into the mud. Like, come on, buddy. Right? It's not that hard. It's not that complicated. It is hard, though. It is hard to do that. It's hard to let go of, and Wendy, you kind of talked about that, to let go of that ego, that pride, that piece to and to move into that. It's interesting that it calls back. I want to move here to another piece, because I want to be, as I said, I'm being conscious of the time here today. They have this abundant catch. The other boat has to come in and help them drag it in, which, by the way, like this would have been the largest catch of fish anybody's ever seen, right? This is just overwhelming, the amount of fish. Simon Peter, why does Simon Peter say, go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man? I mean, Barb, you brought this up. It's such an odd response, as opposed to like, hooray, fish for everyone, right? Like this, what is this? So what we see here is there are a couple things that are happening here. First of all, it's the clue is go away from me, Lord, right? So curio, that word Lord in the Septuagint. So the Hebrew Bible was written predominantly in Hebrew, parts in Aramaic, but mainly in Hebrew. When Alexander the Great conquers the Mediterranean and the Middle East, going and has Alexander the Great's vast empire, the big thing was the Hellenizing of the world, right? And one was that the standard language of written word and scholarship that overwhelmed the entirety of the world was Greek. And so the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. It was called the Septuagint, right? The 70 books, the 70 scholars that put it together, the Septuagint. In the Septuagint, whenever the word Yahweh, right? So Yahweh cannot be written as Yahweh. We do not say or write the name of the Lord. And so you'll see this, especially in a lot of Jewish texts, where it'll say G-D. You will also see this probably in your own Bible. If you look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, wherever Lord is capitalized, that's actually a placeholder for Yahweh, right? That the word there is Yahweh. So when it says God, that's Elohim. When it says Yahweh, it'll be Lord in caps, right? That word in Greek is the Greek word is kurios. It's the same word that Peter's using here. Peter is saying, when Peter was recognizing from what all has happened, from what he saw, the healing of his mother-in-law, the teachings that Jesus has had, that he heard from this miraculous abundance, he is saying, I am in the presence of God. I don't understand it, but I am in God's presence. Now, when people are in the presence of God, prophets predominantly, what is the response, immediate response, when you're in the presence of the divine?
So look away, no?
Yeah.
Or you're humbled.
Humble, fear, right?
Right. Fear,
because you are in the presence of something holy, right? And in the ancient world, there was this belief that when you're in the presence of something truly holy, that the unholy cannot survive in the presence of the holy, right? It cannot survive. Think Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? The reason the Nazi guy's face melts is because the holiness of God cannot be perceived. Isaiah 6, this is almost a direct callback to Isaiah 6. Isaiah has a vision that this is the calling of Isaiah in Isaiah 6, 1 through 11. Isaiah is in the temple of God. God is immense and attended by seraphim, with six-winged seraphim, and his robe fills the temple. And Isaiah's response is, woe to me, for I am a man of unclean lips, living among a people of unclean lips. He knows that he is perceiving the holiness, the benevolence of what God is. It has exposed the sin within him that we all have. And he knows that he can't survive. It cannot survive. That sin, that deceit cannot survive within the presence of God. And so that's where we have that happening. Obviously, Isaiah doesn't die. He's purified with a hot coal, right? That's placed to his lips. Here, Peter is that same thing, right? What is the sin that Peter is repenting from? it's a trick question. Right? There's no sin specific here, right? There's not a, Lord, like, help me, I've been stealing fish from my neighbor for weeks and you caught me and things like that, right? It is a recognition of, there's two pieces here. One is, it's a recognition of his own state and the imperfection within his own soul, which we all have, right? And when I say imperfection, don't think I mean that we do no wrong. Of course we do wrong, right? We make mistakes. But when we talk about perfection, it's that wholeness, right? The fractured self that we don't have that wholeness, that Jewish sense of perfection, tikkun olam, that wholeness, the shalom, right? And we always have those fractured pieces within ourselves, the ones that we inherit and the ones that we develop, right? There's also a piece here, right? Lord, go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinner. It's interesting. At the time in ancient Judaism, the Jewish elite in Jerusalem looked upon those who did not regularly come to temple and did not participate in the sacrifices of the temple, and maybe did not make the pilgrimage to the temple, were labeled as sinners, right? That was the name that was given to them, that they were sinners, which of course included the poorest among them, right? Because to have the luxury of being able to just leave your livelihood and travel to Jerusalem for Passover, right? To buy the sacrifices, to have your money changed, all of those things that later Jesus is going to denounce as he cleanses the temple, all of that corruption, religious corruption. And again, it's religious corruption. It happens in all major religions. But in this case, right, we're talking about the Jewish religion, that corruption would have had a disproportionate effect on the poorest among them, of which Peter may be one. He doesn't have time to go down to the temple, to take a whole week off, to travel by foot all the way to the temple for Passover and all the way back, because to do so means that's the time he's not working, which means then his family will literally starve. He has to take care of his mother-in-law, so he has dependents. It's not just on him, right? This is a thing. So when he says that too, it may also be a recognition that he has believed what he has been told, which is he is not good enough. He is not holy enough. He is not observant enough to be in the presence of this prophet, of this person who is filled with the Spirit of God. And so there's another piece there that may be happening there, which actually gets at that, which again comes to Jesus's message of seeking out the least of these, right? I think of this quite often. One of the ways that one of the big issues we have in church is, if you want to participate in the life of church for the vast majority of it, when do you do it? On Sunday morning.
Right.
And if you have to work on Sunday morning, well, too bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's also why in a lot of places, especially in a lot more in some places of poverty, for a variety of reasons, church is not a one-day-a-week sort of thing, right? Yeah. Not to say, to be honest, it's not at FCC either, right? Like, we got stuff going on every day of the week and 8 times on Sunday. But it is an interesting piece, the way in which sometimes we still create those boundaries. I remember I was talking with a pastor, I think I've shared this before once, about a pastor who wore jeans. And we were talking about how I said, I have a hard time wearing jeans in church. Don't worry, I've since come around. But I said, I grew up that you had to wear a shirt and tie every Sunday and a suit later and all that to church every Sunday. You just didn't go to church without that. It was just a mental thing. I had a hard time. And he talked about the fact that when he wore jeans to church, the first time he did, he had a person who was experiencing extreme poverty who came and thanked him and said, "This is the first time I feel like I belong, because I don't own a suit. I only own jeans. That's why I wear jeans to church, because that's all I own. That's all I have." And so it's just the ways in which we sometimes create. The UCC did a study back in 2000 when they launched the God is Still Speaking campaign, and asked people why they weren't going to church. The number 2 reason was, I don't have the right clothes to wear. The number 2 reason. Wow. How sad, how awful is that? That our churches had become so unwelcoming that people felt, well, I can't go into the church. So it's just kind of an interesting piece, right? Those boundaries that have existed within communities of faith for a long time. Yeah, Wendy.
I don't know if we have time for just a brief story, but my mind is being a little bit blown by this lesson as it relates to a conversation I had with a friend last week. I had been really reeling from what happened at the Capitol and kind of going down a spiral and feeling incredibly self-righteous and angry and all kinds of things. And my friend Touette, who I've known for over 25 years, called out of the blue. We had sort of lost touch since we just started getting really busy at work, and her call was perfectly timed. And she reminded me, I know Touette because she worked with me at my very first professional job at the Vietnamese Association of Illinois, which is a refugee social service center. And she reminded me, she's like, well, you know, Wendy, I get what you're saying, but I come from a country and my family actually fled when a capital actually fell in South Vietnam. And we had to pick up our ramen and our condensed milk packages and flee. She said, you know, I was 3, so I don't remember it a lot. I'm probably sure I wasn't responsible for my own ramen because I had polio, but I'm pretty certain my 4-year-old brother was responsible for his. And boy, does that put things in perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I just kind of heard that feeling echoed today in the news when pollsters are out and asking Americans how optimistic and pessimistic they are and what they're most afraid of. And at least this pollster said most Americans are afraid of other Americans, which is just really sad. And I was really actually, you know, as much as we want the news to be, excuse me, objective, I was joyful when the anchors started talking about how that really is a reflection of our privilege. And I do not mean to undermine anyone who is going through anxiety because it is an anxious time. But I was grateful that they pointed out that there are just regions around the world that can't even imagine the abundance that a lot of us live in. And that we do get so self-absorbed in our self-righteousness that we do miss the mark.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It's hard to not be myopic. Barb, I'm sorry, did you want to say something? I didn't know if okay.
No, I appreciated that, Wendy.
Yeah, that was nice. Thank you.
I want to come to this last piece. Thank you for sharing that, which is fishers of men, right? Or fishers of people, catching people. It's been thankfully inclusivized in both the NRSV and the Common English. So the Simon, James, and John are like the 3 disciples, the 3 amigo disciples, right? That are there. The sons of Zebedee, the brothers of thunder, later they're called. But he says to Simon, by the way, quick side note real quick. Did you notice in verse 8, the only time Simon is referred to as Simon Peter is when he calls out who Jesus is, right? So it's a foreshadowing, right? Because remember, Simon will be renamed Peter when Jesus says, who do people say that I am? And they say, well, you're Elijah, you're John the Baptist returned, you're a prophet. And he says, who do you say that I am? And he says, you are the Messiah. And he goes, truly you're right. And upon, you are Peter, you are the rock. And upon this rock, I will build my church, right? So you see Peter, right? That's why the seed of Peter the first pope, all of that happens. So it's just, I wanted to just note that it's an interesting, names are always interesting when they refer to that. And there's a little like, oh, interesting there. He says, then he says to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. You will be fishers of people. Now, I don't know about you. I have always heard this passage as an evangelistic passage. You will be fishers of people. You will go forth and bring in the good news, right? And tell people the good news. And I've thought that because I don't know my Old Testament very well, to be perfectly honest. And it's one of those. So Ched Myers wrote a great book called Binding the Strong Man, which is a political commentary on the Gospel of Mark, in which this similar passage, this similar phrase, fishers of people, appears. And it's fascinating. So I want to read a quote here. He says, there is perhaps no expression more traditionally misunderstood than Jesus's invitation to these workers to become, quote, fishers of men, end quote. This metaphor, despite the grand old tradition of missionary interpretation, does not refer to the saving of souls, as if Jesus were conferring upon these men instant evangelist status. Rather, this image is carefully chosen from Jeremiah 16, where it is used as a symbol of Yahweh's censure of Israel. Elsewhere, the hooking of fish is a euphemism for judgment upon the rich, such as in Amos 4, and the powerful, as in Ezekiel 29. Taking this mandate for his own, Jesus is inviting the common folk to join him in his struggle in overturning the existing order of power and privilege.
Mhm.
Right?
Wow.
So I just want to read those passages because I think it's helpful. So Jeremiah 16, this is a rebuke against Israel. And when we say rebuke against Israel, it's a rebuke against those in authority, specifically Jeremiah, same with Isaiah, same with Hosea and Amos. The rebuke leading up and into the exile from the prophets was that the Israelites were not caring for the least of these. The widow, the orphan, the immigrant in their land. That is the refrain. It wasn't that they weren't doing worship right. No, they were doing that. And as Isaiah famously says, it made God sick because they weren't loving their neighbor, and you cannot love God unless you love those around you. And so that's it. So in this rebuke, Jeremiah 16:16, quote, "I'm going to send hordes of fishermen to catch them, declares the Lord. Afterward, I will send a party of hunters to hunt them down in every mountain, hill, and cave." Amos 4. "The Lord God has solemnly promised by his holiness, the days are surely coming upon you when they will take you away with hooks, even the last one of you with fish hooks." Ezekiel talking about Pharaoh and the power of corrupt kings and Pharaoh in Ezekiel 29:4, "I will set hooks in your jaws. I will make the fish from the Nile's canals cling to your scales. I will drag you out of the Nile's canals, and also all the fish from the Nile's canals clinging to your scales," right? These are incredible words of rebuke, and we miss that imagery because we don't know our Old Testament that well. Right? We focus a lot on the New Testament. New Testament's great, but we forget Jesus is Jewish and Jesus knows the Old Testament and is using imagery from his holy scriptures, and his message is consistent with those holy scriptures. And so what he's inviting them to do is far more dangerous than just going out and sharing the good news. He's inviting them to help overturn those systems of power. Now, the difficulty is, does that mean that what he's doing is leading a grand liberation movement against Rome? Yes. But is he leading it against the Romans? No, right? This isn't going to be a violent overthrow. This is going to be something different. This isn't going to be like the Zealots, right? Although one of the 12 disciples will be the other Simon, Simon the Zealot. This isn't a violent overthrow. This isn't a distinguishing who's in and who's not. This isn't an us against them. Rather, it is a reordering of all of creation, and it's a reordering of the oppressive systems. And I think that's the important thing. It's the oppressive systems that ignore, trample upon, and marginalize the least of these. And so, and obviously, we will see that framed out in the way in which throughout the gospel, we'll see Jesus lift up the ministry of women, in which we will see Jesus lift up the good news for Gentiles, in which we'll see Jesus reaching out to Romans themselves, Roman centurions and Roman soldiers, but also in the way in which Jesus continually engages also with the powerful and elite. He doesn't ignore them. He doesn't just talk about destroying them. He meets with Pharisees. He meets with the Sadducees. He talks with them. He calls tax collectors who are part of that collaborating elite to be some of his closest followers. And so we see this whole chain from this very beginning, from the beginning of the disciples, he's very clear. This is what I'm calling you to do. What I'm calling you to do is invite people into a new kingdom. And that phrase, the kingdom of God, that new kingdom, is in and of itself a politically charged term. And when we talk about social justice or politics in the Bible, what we're talking about is the fact that there are systems that have happened ever since the time of Jesus, right? There are social concerns. It's not just about individual salvation, about Eric getting up into the pearly gates of heaven. There are social problems. And the Bible is far more concerned about social issues than it is about individual salvation. It's only later that and only very recently that we have changed the Bible to be about individual salvation, as opposed to the social concerns, the social issues, and the social justice that God commands. And we see that in the prophets. We see that obviously in Jesus, as Jesus is challenging. For me, this was one of the first times these last weeks I was looking into this passage that had jumped out, and looking at those passages and digging deeper into, obviously we pulled those verses, but they are faithful to the context. So if you go back and read the verses from Jeremiah, the context around Jeremiah, Amos, and Ezekiel, you will see that it is a faithful pulling out of those verses and interpretation of those. We always have to be careful when somebody just throws out a verse. Sometimes it's taken, as we all know, well out of context. I'm reminded of an inauguration 4 years ago in which my sister said, "Are you going to watch the inauguration? We're going to conclude here in a moment so that y'all can." And she said, "Do you watch the inauguration?" I say, "I always listen to the prayers." I'm always into that because I'm a Bible nerd, right? So 4 years ago, when the highlight of the inauguration was a reading of the Beatitudes, and I about choked on my breakfast when that happened, because it led into, it came from somebody who was inaugurating who had nothing but disparaging things to say about the poor, and then led into a place in which this has not been a particularly good time for those who are the poor or those who mourn. And so it was just, we can take those pieces sometimes out of context, which I think is important. Okay, we got 2 minutes, 1 minute if we're done early. Last thoughts and questions on that. So then the last thing is they leave everything and follow him, which is, by the way, ridiculous, because they literally just won the lottery, right? They have more, like, this is a bumper crop, and they leave it, right? They leave their abundance. They leave all of those vestiges of wealth, security, and they leave that in order to follow Jesus into this kingdom, right? There's an incredible amount of faith there that happens in leaving what was to go forward.
Yeah, and I think back on what happened on Monday evening, where there was in my view, and Wendy, I'm sure shares this, the abundance of blessings that we experienced, and it was, I don't know else to describe it. That's why I felt. I wasn't expecting to sit through everything, and I did, and I'm so glad I did. And so thank you. I mean, so I had this feeling of abundance from that evening. So now what to do with it?
I often think of the fact that of what they, and I'll end on this, but as we move forward, it's a question of what do we take with us and what do we leave behind, right? And looking at Monday, there are things that we need to leave behind, those ideas of privilege and supremacy and all of those things that we need to leave behind.
Right.
But we don't leave everything behind, right? And Peter brings his blessed bumbling curiosity, openness to the gospel, and get it horribly wrong sometimes, but he's still in it, right? He's willing to keep going, and he's willing to keep trying, and that perseverance, that humble boldness that we talked about on Monday night that he embodies, those pieces he carries with him, his desire to learn more and do more, he brings with him. And so I hope that we go forth and continued with a divine curiosity. Right. I was just reading Walt Whitman talks about that we should be divinely curious as opposed to judgmental, right? Instead of judging somebody, be curious as to what's going on. And I think we've lost that, right? We've lost that divine curiosity. Tell me more about you. Tell me your story that leads you to believe or think something that is different from me. I hope I hope that for our church and for us individually, and I hope that for our nation going forward. We're going to conclude because the inauguration is starting. I know that folks may want to watch that. Any last comments before we close? Thank you. It's a lightning round of Bible study. It's been great to be with you. Take care, beloved. I'll see you next week, if not sooner. Bye.
All right. Bye. Thank you.